Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. Strange things happen in the art scenes today. Pictures are removed from exhibitions, poems are painted over, opera productions are discontinued, artists become political activists. And it seems that the freedom of art is being questioned more and more. So the key question of my lecture, of my talk today is, why does art become politicized in liberal democracies? Let's start with the term political art. I think it is not enough to define political art in a way that any work of art is just political art if it deals with a political issue, or each topic can be interpreted in a political way. If one wants to describe the phenomenon political art, then one also needs a sharp concept of political art. One must be able to distinguish political art from non-political art. And here's my suggestion. Here's my definition of political art. Political art is art that takes sides for or against a political position. There's another aspect. The politicization of art encompasses more than just political art. Here's my so there are a lot of different aspects involved here. It concerns also the reception of art, not only the production of art, and there can be legal disputes about the freedom of art involved here. So I would like to show you here 5 different examples. Here you see the Alice Salmon College of Social Work and Social Education in Berlin. Until recently, this poem by Eugen Gomringer was on the facade of the university. After student protests in 2016, the Senate of the university decided to paint over the facade and replace it by another poem. On the left side you see the English translation of the poem. It's originally in Spanish. The quintessence of the poem can be found in the 2 final verses: avenues and flowers and women and an admirer. It's an example of concrete poetry. Eugen Gomringer was the founder of concrete poetry in Germany, and the accusation against this poem was that the poem would be sexist and women would be degraded to the object of male admiration. The German Minister of Culture, Monika Grütters, called the removal of the Gomringer poem a frightening act of cultural barbarism. And not far from the Alice Salomon College in Berlin, there is a housing cooperative, and on the facade of the housing cooperative now you can read the poems again, and it's reinstalled in a Spanish version and in a German version, and it's illuminated at night. So it's a protest against the protest. And I think that is one example of the politicization of art. Here you can see a work by the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei from 2016. It is an installation with 14,000 life jackets which were attached to the pillars of the Berlin concert house. In the middle between the pillars hangs a lifeboat with the inscription "Safe Passage." This is a clear political statement for the government's refugee policy and at the time for a safe passage of refugees across the Mediterranean Sea. Another example, political art can have good intentions and yet it is highly problematic because it exacerbates the political polarization in the society. In August 2016, the politically right-wing identitarian movement in Germany occupied the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin and unrolled this banner, "Secure Borders, Secure Future." This protest took place only half a year after Ai Weiwei's installation in Berlin, and the concert house is only 1 kilometer away from the Brandenburger Gate. While this protest is not directly a work of political art, the identitarian movement uses definitely strategies of the avant-garde and of performance art. In general, one can say that the boundaries between political art and political movements are blurred today. Political art does not necessarily have to be politically leftist, even if that's more often the case, but in the future one must also count with right-wing political art. These two actions are each about a symbolic occupation of buildings in the public space. And in this respect, political art is sharpening the already existing polarization of the society on a symbolic level. Here you see a work from Nikolas Golani, White Noise, American Prairie Rock. The woven rug hangs on the wall and shows an old cathode ray tube that emits only white noise. The TV screen appears here as a prayer rug of Americans. I take this as an ingenious symbol that the television religion of the United States is no longer working. The work is complex and it is ambiguous. I like it, and actually it does not contain any political message, I thought. However, on the Flickr account of Golani, there is a remarkable self-interpretation of this work by the artist. He writes, "The work points to whiteness as a construct used throughout the world to obliterate voices and rights of cultures regardless of complexion, calling attention to white noise as a source of increasing intolerance and hate in the United States, as politicians, media, and citizens attempt to mask and obliterate the reality of America's genocidal past and racist present." This is a political self-interpretation of the work, which would certainly not come alone without the text. There is no information on the work itself that links white noise to white skin. In this case, or whiteness, in this case, a work of art is politically framed by the artist himself. This too is an example, I think, of a politicization of the arts today. In this example, you see Yonatan Mazur, a German artist, at a theater performance in Mannheim in the year 2013. Part of the performance was the artist shows a Hitler salute and a swastika, whereupon he was charged with a lawsuit. By paragraph 86A of the German Penal Code, the Penal Code criminalizes the use of symbols of unconstitutional organization, and this includes, first and foremost, Nazi symbols. Later, the prosecutor stopped the investigation against Mazur on the grounds that in this case, the limits of artistic freedom were not exceeded. So the politicization of the art shows itself in very different ways. On the left side, you have example of political art, where the line between art and political activism becomes fluid. On the right side, you can see examples of non-political art being politically received. An apolitical poem is interpreted as a sexist text, but you have other examples where the critique is on the grounds of it's racist, or it is a text or an artwork would not respond properly to other cultures, and so on. And then you have this self-interpretation and this framing, this political framing of an artist by himself. And there is a case, and there is Mazur's performance which tests the limits of artistic freedom. So it is also a sign of politicization that of the arts that he was sued for doing so. The difference between art and politics seems to be no longer self-evident in the society. That's why he is sued. Mazur has, so to speak, confirmed the difference between fictionality and reality by a court order. So that are my examples. I come now to the second part and to a theoretical model. It is like an intermezzo, and it has nothing to do with political art immediately. Rather, I would like to introduce to you to this model because I would like to use it in the third part in order to analyze political art. So, and I can be short here because the theory model has been translated into Slovenian and has been published by the Institute Nova Revija. There's also an extended version, German version in the Slovenian journal Phenomena. And if you are interested in, there is also an English translation of this model, and you can find this on my website. The basic idea is that the great caesuras of modern art, that is the caesuras between fine arts, classical modernism, avant-garde, post-modernism, and contemporary art, which I call reflexive modernism, that these caesuras can be reconstructed as a history of differentiation. That is by a gradual decoupling of the basic components of art communication, and these basic components are the work, the medium, and the concept of an artwork, which are here abbreviated by M, W, and C. The result of this differentiation is, first of all, there are new degrees of freedom. New degrees of freedom are in the art communication, in the art system, which is, and I try to represent this in this model by the gap between the three components on the last circle. And secondly, there has been a paradigm shift in the 20th century, a paradigm shift from material aesthetics to gehalt-aesthetics. I come back to this. The starting point are the fine arts in the 19th century, where medium, work, and concept are still firmly bound, and they are still firmly linked, and it goes without saying that a work of art expresses the aesthetic value of beauty in various styles. That was the basic idea of the fine art. And as a result of the Industrial Revolution and of the emergence of the bourgeoisie as a new social class, artists and the arts also gained a new kind of political and economic independence, and in this way the arts gained a new way of freedom and autonomy. And for the first time in art history, art has become so free to reject its own constitutive premises. In other words, modern art has gained a new capacity, the capacity for self-negation. Modern art emerges the moment it rejects the aesthetic value of beauty. That meant art negated the media of the fine arts, so the media which constitutes the experience of beauty. This leads to negation of the tonal system in music. This leads to the negation of the central perspective in painting, and this leads to the negation of the classical verse format in poetry. Instead, the artists, composers, and poets now start to explore other aesthetic values, such as the aesthetically sublime, the aesthetic event, and the aesthetic ambivalence. And the art which is emerging now, it's usually called classical modernism because it develops a new specific modern type of aesthetics with isms like cubism or expressionism. The historical avant-garde goes one step further and turns against classical modernism. The avant-garde also challenges now the premise that art must necessarily be aesthetic. This means that the art which is emerging is not only dispenses with the medium of art, but also negates the category of the work, because the work of art is a place where a certain aesthetics experience can be created. So the radical avant-garde art reduces art to the representation of a concept, and thus the ultimate art form of the avant-garde art is conceptualism, it's conceptual art. Here you will find the ready-mades from Marcel Duchamp. Here you will find zero-point art. You will find Rauschenberg's Erase the Kuhn drawing or 433 by John Cage. The key idea in this model is that postmodern art has not stopped but rather continued this modern logic of negation. Postmodern art was a reaction against the historical avant-garde in the sense of a double negation. Postmodernism negates, so to speak, the negation of the aesthetic dimension and rehabilitates the use of the medium of the fine arts. So once again, you have figurative painting in postmodernism, and you have tonal music, and you have classical verses. The medium comes back in this model, but it comes back with a trick, namely with irony or as a quotation. The reuse of the old media of the fine arts is thus not naive. It is highly reflected, which here in the model is symbolized by the gap between the medium and the concept. Above all, postmodernism was a game with the history of art, with its styles and with isms. Postmodern art unfolds in the form of an open artwork. And the notion of the open artwork is introduced by Umberto Eco. But the open artwork lacks the crucial aspect of a work of art. The open artwork does not create new textures of meaning, but deconstructs meaning. In this respect, postmodernism has further suspended the category of the artwork. As can be seen in the model here, postmodernism lacks the W, so the component of the work in art communication. That's not important. Today, a negation of the category of the artwork has taken place. So the work is no longer an open artwork. The forms in the work join together to generate new textures of meaning once again. This creates a type of art that is no longer postmodern, and I would like to call it is highly reflected, and one can speak about this kind of art. It is art of reflexive modernism, and I use this idea of reflexive modernism, which has been introduced by the German sociologist Ulrich Beck. The art of reflexive modernism can be described by the decoupling of medium, work, and concept. And you can see this in the model because there is always a gap between these three components of art communication. And this means that in such a reflexive art, nothing is taken for granted, but it depends on the concepts and on the concepts, and it's highly difficult to interpret this kind of art. Here you can see the whole model again. It shows first that modern art produced a new step and a new degree of freedom in the 20th century. And secondly, there has been a paradigm shift taking place, a paradigm shift from material aesthetics to what I call it gehalt-aesthetics. You can translate it like content aesthetics, or you can translate it like subject matter aesthetics. Conceptualism is a turning point of this paradigm shift. Modern art has a genuine claim of being new. Novelty can be achieved in art in two different ways. Either one generates new aesthetics experience by including into the art new aesthetic material, by including new forms, new techniques, or new languages of art. In this mode of innovation, the art of classical modernity has developed. In other words, it followed a paradigm of material aesthetics. Already with the zero-point works of the historical avant-garde, it became clear that this form of material progress is exhausted or cannot prolonged. As a result, there has been a paradigm shift that I call a gehalt-aesthetic turn or a subject matter turn. The novelty of a work is now determined via new themes or new subject matter of the artworks, or the subject matter and the topic is presented in a new way. The aesthetic content of an artwork is not simply content. So it is much more a pattern of experience which is generated by an interpretation of that artwork. So much for the model of aesthetic modernity that I now want to use to analyze political art. In fact, the third part develops a critique of political art. Political art unfolds today under the paradigm of gehalt-aesthetics. And of course, political art has also a gehalt, it has also a content, but this content is one-dimensional and unambiguous, so that the artwork can take sides in a political conflict. I will introduce now three different levels of analysis: a psychological level, a political level, and an art-specific level. Let's start with the psychological dimension. In psychology, there is a five-factor model that describes each person's personality. It's called the Big Five, and these Big Five personality traits are conscientiousness, neuroticism, extraversion, agreeability, and openness. Openness for new experiences. And only this last personality trait is interesting for us in our discussion. It's openness for experience. And you can find on the one hand people with a very high degree of openness, and these people are curious and they are interested in the arts and in philosophy. And on the other hand, you have people with the high, and on the other hand, you have people with low openness who are described in psychology as being conservative and careful. And this characterization, conservative, also shows that here a political dimension is involved. Political conservative voters generally have low values of openness for new experiences and prefer pre-modern art forms. So they love classical music, they read novels of Thomas Mann, and they live aesthetically in the 19th century. But even socialist realism or nationalist art usually works with this pre-modern art forms, with the full circle, because this is the best way to present and to confirm a particular worldview to the people. Political art is primarily political left-wing art and sees itself both aesthetically and politically as progressive, as an avant-garde. In most cases, political art takes on the format of conceptual art, as you can see here. The format of conceptualism, which is highly anesthetic or anti-aesthetic, has always gives still the impression of an avant-garde. You are not conservative at all if you use such kind of art form. Conceptualism has the advantage of having an avant-garde design, one can say, although it has no longer it has now for a long time established as an art form. For political art, conceptualism is attractive because of its isomorphism principle. What do I mean by that? It is an isomorphism, is a one-to-one relationship between, and here it's a one-to-one relationship between the idea of the artwork and the artwork itself. It is a one-to-one relationship between the concept and the percept, that is, what is you can perceive from an artwork. So conceptual art provides a sensual representation of an idea in a pure form. That is an advantage for political art, and you see it here in this example. The concept of Weiwei's life jacket installation was safe passage, and what you could see was the red carpet as a safe passage for the visitors into the concert hall. Conceptual art does not automatically mean political art, and the best example is another work of Weiwei, his work Dropping a Han Dynasty Urn, and this is a very multi-layered and ambivalent work of art which articulates a cultural conflict in China rather than proclaiming a political message. Progressive and conservative political attitudes share a low degree of openness to new experience. For conservatives, the case is clear. They are concerned with the preservation of a social order. They are concerned with the preservation of a tradition. For progressives, the situation is trickier. They want, of course, a different social order, but this order has nothing vague and indeterminate, but it is defined by a political agenda. One is, for example, for environmental protection, against discrimination, for open borders, against the nation state. Even if multiculturalism and openness are the central values of a progressive worldview, then it is a fixed and a stable worldview. One can certainly present a social ideal of openness without being open to new experiences, if only because this could destabilize one's own political attitude. In most cases, a right-wing political attitude was accompanied by a conservative taste in the arts and a preference for the pre-modern art form. But I suspect that this is changing today. And it's changing because conceptual art becomes common knowledge. Children learn about conceptual art in school, and you encounter conceptual art in the museums and on the documenta, on the biennals, and conceptualism is used by advertising. So it's all around. And the connection between forms of politically leftist and a politically leftist position and avant-garde art was, in my opinion, a historical connection, and as you can see now in this protest action of the identitarian movement, so right-wing movements can take over such strategies also, and as you know, the futurists also sympathized with fascism. The political attitude that has the strongest affinity to reflexive art is, in my opinion, a liberal attitude. Classical liberalism addresses the free individual and expects art to take the individual seriously in its freedom. In this sense, a liberal political attitude is most compatible with a reflexive art that requires openness for new experiences. Ultimately, political liberalism is itself in a crisis today, especially because it has allied itself with neoliberalism, with an economic neoliberalism. It is therefore also a challenge to rethink the idea of political liberalism today, and I suspect and I hope that political liberalism could also learn something from the freedom of reflexive art. If you analyze what reflexive art has in mind with the freedom of art. Political art is a legitimate option in an autonomous art system, and that has always existed, and it will always exist also in the future. It is out of question whether political art is art or is not art. The question that arises is, why does political art become so dominant today? That is the question. At its core, postmodern art was apolitical and, for the most part, politically incorrect. All cultural values have been deconstructed, whether they were on the left side or they were on the right. And postmodern art's in a way cynical. And political art was rather marginal in postmodernism and was even considered as uncool in postmodern times. So the politicization of the arts, though the question is, of course, why happens now this kind of politicization of the arts? It was unthinkable even 10 years ago, this kind of moralization and politicization. And here's my argument. The politicization of the arts is, above all, a media phenomenon. The new social media such as Twitter, Facebook, blogs also create new spaces for political discourses that can directly influence aesthetic discourses in the art scenes. The new social media are an interface, a new interface for political discourses and for artistic discourses. And this interface didn't exist 10 years ago, or 5 years ago even. The most convincing explanation here, and the question once again is why political art interventions in the art scenes cannot simply be ignored, as it was always the case, and why they are even successful. And the most convincing explanation here is an idea by Chas Sunstein and his law of group polarization. Empirical research has shown that after a discussion, the members of a group represent more extreme positions than before the discussion. When the group shares a certain value, such as the value of social justice or environmental protection or an idea of nationalism. So, for example, if a group is moderately committed to protecting the environment, then it is very likely that they will demand more extreme environmental standards as a result of a discussion. So there are two factors. There are two factors which work together to explain why the art scenes are politicized today. The first factor are the new media and the new interface for discourses. And the second factor is this law of group polarization. So the politicization of the art scenes ultimately lead to a questioning of the freedom of art and to a loss of artistic autonomy, which until recently seemed unthinkable. Ultimately, there are fundamental difficulties in why the representatives of art institutions today cannot simply invoke the freedom of art. For today, there is no longer a positive definition of artistic freedom available. That's my idea, with which curators, festival directors, and other decision makers in the art scenes could work. And in the age of avant-garde, the freedom of art could be understood as border crossing. And every border crossing was an act of freedom, which generated new aesthetic experiences and new perceptions. which expanded the realm of possibilities. With the end of material progress, this legitimation strategy has been lost. And the question is whether the freedom of art can be justified in a different way today. I think that is the core question for the art scene, for a liberal art scene. If one can no longer determine the concept of artistic freedom in the paradigm of material aesthetics, then one can still try to determine the freedom of art in relation to the society. So in this other gehalt-aesthetic paradigm. And here's my suggestion that the new freedom of art lies in generating new patterns of experience and accordingly provoking new self-descriptions in the society. The reflexive art fulfills no political but a pre-political function in this way, and I would like to make some remarks now about the relationship of art and politics in order a little bit to elaborate this idea. Politics create extreme complex, politics in general creates extreme complexity reductions of the world. Politics constructs, it has the task to construct alternative political position between which voters can choose, and thereby referring to a shared worldview that can be accepted by a majority of the population. Such worldviews, politics cannot generate by itself. It has to pre-propose a common sense, a ground in respect to which you can propose political alternative for the voters. In times of great social upheaval, such social self-descriptions become blurred and can no longer correctly reflect social conflicts. And I think we are dealing today with such a worldview crisis. On the other hand, art possesses the capacity to portray the world in all its contradictions and does not fit into any left-right schemes, and can help with the works to evoke new, more adequate self-descriptions of the society. In this sense, reflexive art helps liberal democracies remain fit for reform, creating the conditions for collectively binding decision, that is, for successful politics. So much now for the theory of political arts, and I would like finally to explain, to illustrate these ideas by an example, namely by the film by Ruben Östlund, The Square. The film deals with a variety of political issues, but it is not an example of political art. Rather, it changes our self-perception and our self-description, which determines which social conflicts can be transformed into political alternatives. It changes our self-perception and our self-description, which determine which social conflict can be transformed into a political alternative. The content of the film The Square are our ideas about borders, borderlines, and border crossings. These ideas structure the self-description of our society on which politics must be based, and thereby also define very substantially which political decisions can be made in a society. Here you see Christian. Christian is the man with the glasses. He is a curator of a large museum of contemporary art in Stockholm. He is on his way to the museum. A woman is screaming. He puts himself protectively in front of her while his wallet and his cell phone are stolen. In this scene you see Christian with an assistant who is a migrant. They can locate the stolen mobile phone on a computer, and the thief apparently lives in a skyscraper with hundreds of apartments. The assistant then suggests writing 100 threatening letters and dropping them into each letterbox in the skyscraper. Here we are dealing with the first border crossing. In the film, Christian does not follow the rules of a Swedish state, but follows the logic of a culture in which one cannot rely on the police. Christian actually gets his wallet back and his cell phone back, but the story is not over. Here you see the little boy holding Christian's threatening letter in his hand. He demands an apology from Christian because he is not a thief, he says. The scene is about a cultural border that Christian cannot cross because he does not understand that this boy from an immigrant family has a very strong notion of honor. He does not apologize to the boy, which causes a personal disaster for him. He will lose his job. Here you see Christian in a conversation with an American journalist who seduced him at a party and which took him and with whom he spent a night in her apartment. She wants to start a relationship. For him, it was a one-night stand. When he shows no interest in a love affair with her, she accuses him of using his power as a museum curator to seduce her. This scene is about boundaries of intimacy that can be crossed by mutual consent. If the agreement is subsequently called into question, this border crossing turns into a criminal act. The ingenious idea of Östlund's movie is that he combines two different types of border crossings in the film, namely the crossings of boundaries in life and the crossings of boundaries in the arts. Both forms of border crossings are manifest themselves in the person of Christian, who is a normal being and who is an art expert. Here you can see the artwork with the telling title, "You Have Nothing," which consists of piles of earth and a neon sign. In the scene, a cleaner cleans the spaces between the piles of earth and demolishes the artwork. The man, so to speak, crosses the line between art and non-art with his cleaning machine because he cannot recognize the borderline between art and non-art. Here you see the artists of this earth pile installation with a curator of the museum, and during the panel discussion a man in the audience makes sexually offensive remarks to the female curator. As it turns out, the man suffers from Tourette syndrome. Everyone understands and follows the code of inclusion of the mentally ill into social life. Inclusion policy is in principle a socially wanted border crossing. The boundary between the mentally ill and the healthy should be eliminated in the public space. This, as shown here, can have serious and grotesque consequences. The socially desired border crossing, the inclusion of the mentally ill, leads to the fact that open sexism must be tolerated. The dramatic climax of the film is the performance, which takes place in front of the High Society of Stockholm and of sponsors of the museum. An East European artist plays a gorilla, and he chases away by shouting and intimidation several visitors. In particular, he chases away the artist of the earth pile installation, which is a grandiose symbolic act. The gorilla artist shows that he is the more advanced artist. He is the alpha male of art, who takes the border crossing of art and life radically serious and who does not play only with earth. In the end, he simulates a rape, the rape of this woman, and until the guests step in and beat him up. The boundaries of art are crossed so radically until finally it becomes clear that the avant-garde paradigm of border crossing has come to an end and it is completely exhausted. In this scene you see Christian in conversation with one of his staff who always brings his infant to the meetings. Again, this is a socially wanted border crossing. It should be possible for employees to cross the line between family and work. At the crucial moment, however, this older father is so busy with his infant that it comes to a disaster. He puts an advertising video online without showing it to Christian before. And here you see a picture of this promotional video. It's a video for the museum's next art project with the title The Square. The Square is an installation in front of the museum which consists of a square of 4 by 4 meters. On the bronze plaque in front of it you can read, "The square is a place of refuge where there is trust and mindfulness. Everyone has the same rights and obligations here." It is thus created a utopian place of absolute help. If someone crosses the border into the square, then he must be helped. You could also say the square is a safe space in public. The promotional video shows a little girl standing in the square with a cat in her arms and suddenly being blown up in a terrorist act. The video triggers a viral hit, but also leads to a shitstorm in the social media, which ultimately leads to Christians being fired from his job. The two advertisers also cross a border here, namely the border between advertising and art. They no longer see themselves as a service provider for the arts, but they see themselves as media artists. The subject matter of the square are border crossings. Border crossings in all areas of life, in relation to art, in relation to migrants, in relation to other cultures, in love relationships, in relation to the beggars, homeless, and the needy in the society. It is about overcoming the boundary between work and life and private life. It is about the inclusion of the mentally ill into the public sphere. Again and again you come across with the basic belief, the belief that has its origins in the art scenes, but has now become the unquestionable premise of a postmodern worldview. And as a curator, Christian embodies exactly this point of view. For the avant-garde, crossing a border was always a positive thing, whereas a fixed border is something negative. The Square is a film about the limitations of this idea of crossing borders, that crossing borders is automatically linked to progress. And it shows a Western society that is overwhelmed by all its wanted and unwanted border crossing. Boundaries and crossings are neither positive nor negative, but highly ambivalent. By showing this ambivalence, the film depoliticized the concept of the border. So I have reached the end of my talk. The criticism of political art that I have presented to you reacts to a new historical situation in which the autonomy of the art is called into question by political discourses and by political activism. A critique of political art means, first of all, to make the phenomenon of political art observable. And that is only possible if one introduces a counter term to political art. And my counterterm to political art is reflexive art, in which the freedom of art can be positively determined again. A positively defined concept of artistic freedom is, I think, essential in conflict with a politicized art. Thank you very much.